The wind whispered through the ruins of a once thriving city. Crumbled walls and scorched earth stretched as far as the eye could see. Amidst the silence, Aerith knelt on the broken ground, her trembling hands clutching a small, charred toy. It was all that remained of her child, a simple wooden figure that once brought giggles to her little one. Now, it was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Her heart ached, but her tears had dried long ago. Grief had turned into something sharper, harder, an unyielding desire for revenge. The humans had come to her planet with fire and fury, leaving no room for mercy. Aerith had watched helplessly as they destroyed her home, her people, and worst of all, her child. She had hidden in the shadows, powerless to stop the carnage. That guilt weighed on her soul as much as her loss. Aerith rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She had spent weeks combing through the ruins, looking for survivors, answers, anything. But the humans had been thorough. Her people were gone, their stories silenced. Only she remained, the last voice of her kind. And she would not let that voice fade quietly. "They will pay," she whispered, her voice like steel. "Every last one of them." The humans had a name for the one who led the attack, Commander Kane. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, a man known for his ruthlessness in battle. Aerith didn't care about his reputation. To her, he was nothing more than a monster she intended to kill. With renewed determination, Aerith adjusted the thin cloak draped over her shoulders, concealing the plasma blade at her side. The weapon hummed faintly, a reminder of its deadly purpose. She had salvaged it from the battlefield, a human weapon now turned against its creators. It was poetic in a way, she thought. As she moved through the ruins, her sharp senses stayed alert. The air was thick with the stench of ash and decay, but Aerith had learned to ignore it. Each step brought her closer to the human outpost, a small base they had established on the outskirts of her world. Her people had called this place Virith, a name that now felt like a distant memory. The journey was perilous. Aerith knew the humans patrolled the area, searching for any lingering survivors. She had narrowly escaped them before, hiding in the rubble or blending into the shadows. Her kind were masters of stealth, and now, that skill was her greatest weapon. She would strike from the darkness, swift and unseen. As night fell, Aerith reached the edge of the human outpost. From her vantage point atop a rocky hill, she could see the glowing lights of their camp. Soldiers moved about, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Aerith's sharp eyes scanned the area, her gaze locking onto a figure standing near the center of the camp. It was him, Commander Kane. Even from a distance, he was unmistakable. His broad frame was encased in human battle armor, his stance confident and commanding. He barked orders to his soldiers, his voice deep and firm. Aerith felt a surge of rage as she watched him, her hands tightening into fists. This was the man responsible for her child's death. He didn't look like a monster, but Aerith knew better. Monsters often wore the faces of men. She waited in the darkness, observing every detail of the camp. The humans had erected barriers and positioned guards at key points. Getting close to Kane would not be easy, but Aerith had no intention of rushing in blindly. She had waited this long. She could wait a little longer. Revenge, she reminded herself, was a dish best served cold. As the hours passed, Aerith planned her next move. The humans seemed relaxed, unaware of the predator lurking just beyond their walls. She smiled grimly. Let them enjoy their false sense of security. It would make their downfall all the sweeter. Suddenly, a sound behind her broke her focus, a faint rustle in the underbrush. Aerith spun around, her blade sliding into her hand with practiced ease. The weapon's glow cast an eerie light on the rocks around her. But there was nothing there, only the wind stirring the leaves. Aerith's grip on the blade tightened as her heart raced. She couldn't afford to be careless. Every sound, every movement could be a threat. She had to stay sharp, stay focused. Her survival depended on it. Taking a deep breath, she sheathed the blade and turned her attention back to the camp. The figure of Commander Kane was still visible, a constant reminder of her mission. Aerith's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't know how or when, but she vowed to make him suffer for what he had done. For her child, for her people, for everything she had lost. Aerith would not rest until justice was served. The hunt begins. The darkness of the alien night wrapped around Aerith like a cloak as she moved closer to the human outpost. Every step was deliberate, her movements silent and fluid, a testament to her kind's natural stealth. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from fear, but from the anticipation of facing the man who had taken everything from her. Commander Kane. The outpost sprawled before her like a blight on the land. Its walls, made of reinforced steel and glowing with faint blue energy fields, seemed to mock the desolation surrounding it. Human soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their weapons slung lazily over their shoulders. They laughed and joked, oblivious to the predator watching them from the shadows. Aerith crouched behind a cluster of jagged rocks, her sharp eyes scanning the camp. Her people's vision was adapted for low light, and even the faintest movement within the camp was clear to her. She could see the humans gathered around a makeshift fire pit, eating and drinking, as though they had no care in the world. The sight made her blood boil. But her gaze was drawn to the center of the camp, where a figure stood apart from the others. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His armor was more ornate than the others, bearing the insignia of a high-ranking officer. There was no mistaking him. Commander Kane. For a moment, Aerith froze. She had imagined this moment countless times, the man who haunted her nightmares standing within her reach. But now, seeing him up close, she was struck by an odd sensation. He didn't look like the monster she had envisioned. His face was stern, yes, but there was a weariness in his eyes, as though he carried burdens of his own. Shaking off the thought, Aerith focused on her plan. She couldn't afford distractions. The human security was lax, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility of danger. She would use that to her advantage. Her plasma blade hummed faintly at her side, its energy pulsing in rhythm with her determination. As she prepared to move, a faint sound reached her ears. Footsteps, light and cautious, approached from behind. Aerith's muscles tensed, her instincts screaming danger. She turned just in time to see a shadowy figure lunging toward her. Without hesitation, she drew her blade, its glow illuminating the attacker's face. A human soldier. The man's expression shifted from confidence to shock as Aerith's blade hummed dangerously close to his throat. She moved swiftly, disarming him with a twist of her wrist and pinning him to the ground. His weapon clattered to the rocks, and he struggled against her hold, but Aerith's strength and training were unmatched. "Who sent you?" she hissed, her voice low and menacing. The soldier's eyes widened in fear. "And no one. I was just." Aerith silenced him with a sharp twist of her blade, pressing it closer to his skin. "Lies will only make this worse for you." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching voices made Aerith's ears perk up. More soldiers were coming. She cursed under her breath. The fight had made more noise than she intended. She couldn't risk an all-out confrontation, not yet. Reluctantly, she struck the soldier with the hilt of her blade, rendering him unconscious. Dragging his limp body behind the rocks, Aerith melted back into the shadows. She watched as two soldiers arrived, their flashlights sweeping the area. They exchanged confused glances, muttering to each other in their guttural human language. One of them gestured toward the rocks, but after a moment, they moved on, their footsteps fading into the night. Aerith exhaled slowly, her grip on her blade relaxing slightly. The encounter had been too close. She couldn't afford another mistake like that. Her mission was too important. As the camp settled once more, Aerith began her approach again, this time taking even greater care. She scaled the outer wall with the help of a grappling hook, her movements quick and silent. The inside of the camp was a maze of tents and machinery, but Aerith navigated it with ease. Her target was clear. Reaching the command tent, she paused, her ears straining to catch any sound from within. She could hear voices, one of them unmistakably Kane's. His tone was calm but firm, issuing orders to his subordinates. Aerith's fingers tightened around her blade as she prepared to strike. But then, something stopped her. Kane's words were not what she expected. "We need to find them before more lives are lost. The mercenaries responsible for Virith's destruction are still out there. I won't let this turn into a war." Aerith's heart skipped a beat. Mercenaries? What was he talking about? The humans had attacked her world, hadn't they? Doubt began to creep into her mind, challenging the narrative she had clung to for so long. She stayed hidden, listening as Kane continued. His voice was filled with frustration, but also something else. Remorse. The man she had sworn to kill was not celebrating the destruction of her people. He was hunting those who had done it. For the first time, Aerith hesitated. Her blade, so steady in her hand, now felt heavy. The hatred that had fueled her was no longer as clear-cut as it had been. She had come here seeking vengeance, but now she wasn't sure who the true enemy was. A truth revealed. Aerith crouched in the dim corner of the human command tent, hidden by a combination of shadows and her people's stealth technology. Her heart raced, but her instincts kept her steady. She had infiltrated the heart of the human outpost, standing mere feet away from Commander Kane, the man she believed responsible for the death of her child and the annihilation of her people. The tent was sparse, its metal frame reinforced with energy panels. A glowing holographic map projected above the central table displayed various star systems and troop movements. Kane stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring intently at the map while two other officers exchanged reports. "We've confirmed the location of the mercenary fleet," one officer said, his tone clipped. "They're hiding in the Ilian Nebula. But their resources, Commander, they're using weapons and tech far beyond what mercenaries should have access to." "Someone's funding them," Kane replied, his voice cold but composed. The attack on Virith wasn't just about destruction. They wanted to provoke a war between humans and Aerith's people. They've succeeded. Aerith's fingers tightened around the hilt of her plasma blade as her mind raced to process his words. She had expected to hear gloating, maybe cruel jokes about the lives lost on her planet. Instead, she was hearing something far more shocking: regret. The humans weren't just aware of the massacre. Kane himself was working to stop the ones responsible. "Commander," the other officer said hesitantly, "permission to speak freely." Kane gave a curt nod. "You've spent weeks chasing ghosts," the officer said, his frustration evident. "We've lost good men trying to bring these mercenaries to justice. But with respect, this isn't our war anymore. We shouldn't be risking lives to clean up someone else's mess." Kane's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the tent was silent. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "It became our war the moment they used our banners to justify their crimes. They slaughtered civilians, children, under the guise of human authority. I won't let that stand. Not on my watch." Aerith's chest tightened. His words carried weight, not just as a commander, but as someone who truly seemed to care. She wanted to dismiss it as an act, a ploy to manipulate his subordinates, but the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't the man she had imagined. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't argue further. They saluted and left the tent, leaving Kane alone. Aerith watched him carefully as he sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. The confident, commanding presence he had displayed moments ago seemed to melt away, replaced by a man burdened by guilt and responsibility. Aerith's mind churned with conflicting emotions. Could it be true? Could Kane, the man she had blamed for everything, actually be hunting the real culprits? Her entire world had been shaped by the belief that humans were her enemies. But now, that foundation was crumbling. Taking a deep breath, Aerith stepped out of the shadows, her blade held tightly in her hand. Kane's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he reached for his sidearm. But before he could draw it, Aerith activated her stealth cloak, disappearing from view. I wouldn't, she said, her voice low and steady. Kane froze, his hand hovering over his weapon. Who's there? I could kill you where you stand, she continued, circling him silently. But I want answers. Kane's eyes darted around the tent, searching for the source of her voice. If you're here to talk, show yourself. Aerith hesitated. Every instinct told her to stay hidden, to strike from the shadows if needed. But something about Kane's tone, calm, almost weary, made her pause. Slowly, she deactivated her cloak, stepping into the faint glow of the holographic map. Kane's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. His hand still hovered near his weapon, but he didn't draw it. You're Erithian. And you're the butcher of Virith, she spat, her blade humming to life. You don't deserve to breathe. Kane's expression darkened, but he didn't flinch. If I were responsible, you'd already be dead. But I'm not the one you're looking for. Liar. Aerith took a step closer, her blade inches from his throat. I saw the human ships. Your soldiers. Your weapons. And who gave you those weapons? Who authorized the attack? Kane asked, his voice firm. It wasn't me. It wasn't even the human military. It was mercenaries, criminals who profit from war. Aerith's blade trembled, her resolve faltering. Why should I believe you? Kane met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and something she didn't expect. Sorrow. Because I'd lost people too. I know what it feels like to stand in the ruins of your life, wondering why. I know the pain you carry. That's why I'm here, to stop this madness before it happens again. For a moment, the tent was silent, save for the faint hum of the hologram. Aerith searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit, but all she found was truth. Her grip on the blade slackened, and she stepped back. If you're lying, I'll kill you. Kane nodded, his expression unchanging. Fair enough. But if you want justice for your people, you'll need my help. An uneasy alliance. The air inside the command tent was heavy with tension as Aerith stared at Commander Kane. Her blade was still in her hand, glowing faintly, though it hung by her side, instead of poised for a strike. Kane stood before her, calm yet unyielding, his expression unreadable. For a man she had planned to kill mere minutes ago, he was strangely composed, almost resigned to the precarious situation. You expect me to trust you? Aerith's voice dripped with venom. You, a human, after what your kind has done. Kane folded his arms, his expression hardening. I don't expect you to trust me, but I do expect you to listen. If you want to stop the ones responsible for your people's suffering, we have a common enemy, and you can't fight them alone. Aerith clenched her jaw, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Every instinct screamed at her to reject him, to strike him down, and continue her mission alone. But his words echoed in her mind. Common enemy. The evidence was undeniable. The mercenaries, not the human military, had orchestrated the massacre of her world. And Kane, for all his faults, seemed genuinely committed to bringing them to justice. Finally, she spoke, her tone sharp and measured. If this is some kind of trick. It's not, Kane interrupted, his voice firm. You don't have to like me. You don't even have to forgive me for what you think I've done. But if we don't work together, more lives will be lost. Innocent lives. Aerith's gaze narrowed, her grip on the plasma blade tightening. The idea of working alongside a human, the very species she had sworn to destroy, was repugnant. Yet she couldn't ignore the practicality of his offer. Alone, she was a hunter in the dark, outnumbered and outgunned. With Kane, she might have a chance to bring the true culprits to justice. Fine, she said finally, her voice low but steady. But this is not a partnership. It's an alliance of necessity. And if you betray me, you'll kill me, Kane finished, nodding. Understood. The uneasy truce solidified. Kane quickly began outlining the situation. He gestured to the holographic map, highlighting a cluster of stars near the Ilion Nebula. The mercenaries are hiding here, he explained. They're using stolen tech to mask their location, but we've managed to pinpoint a weak signal. They're likely preparing for another attack. On another alien colony, Aerith said bitterly, folding her arms. They'll use it to provoke more violence, turn my people and yours into pawns in their war. Kane nodded grimly. Exactly. If we don't stop them now, they'll keep escalating until there's no turning back. We have to intercept them before they strike again. Aerith frowned, studying the map. You say we, but your soldiers won't follow me into battle. I've seen the way humans look at my kind. They won't be coming, Kane replied. This mission is off the books. Officially, the Alliance Command wants nothing to do with it. They think it's too risky, too costly. So it's just us. Aerith raised an eyebrow. 2 against an entire fleet of mercenaries. I thought humans were supposed to be strategic. Kane smirked faintly. We'll have help. There's a supply ship on its way, carrying tech and intel we'll need to level the playing field. But if we're going to make this work, we'll need to leave immediately. Aerith's instincts flared at the mention of more humans. And what guarantee do I have that this ship won't be filled with soldiers waiting to ambush me? Kane sighed, running a hand through his hair. You don't. But if I wanted to capture or kill you, I had my chance back there when you walked into my camp. You're still alive because I need you, and because I believe you want justice as much as I do. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Aerith allowed herself to consider the possibility that he might be telling the truth. She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. Instead, she found something unexpected, a flicker of vulnerability. He wasn't just fighting for her people, he was fighting for something he had lost as well. Fine, she said at last, stepping back. I'll come with you, but make no mistake, Kane. I don't trust you. Fair enough, he said, his tone neutral. Now let's move. Time isn't on our side. The journey to the rendezvous point was tense. Aerith and Kane traveled aboard a stolen hovercraft, its engine humming softly as it glided over the barren landscape. Neither of them spoke much, the silence filled with unspoken resentment and distrust. Kane focused on piloting the craft while Aerith kept her blade close, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Hours later, they arrived at a secluded clearing where a sleek, unmarked supply ship awaited. A human pilot greeted them, but Aerith kept her distance, her sharp eyes watching for any sign of treachery. To her surprise, the pilot barely acknowledged her, instead focusing on unloading crates of weapons and equipment. These should help, Kane said, gesturing to the crates. Energy shields, advanced targeting systems, and a few surprises the mercenaries won't see coming. Aerith inspected the gear cautiously. Impressive. But it won't matter if we can't find their base. Kane smirked, holding up a small data chip. That's where this comes in. It's a partial decryption of their signal. With it, we can pinpoint their exact location. Aerith frowned, still uneasy. Let's hope your intel is as good as you claim, human. For all our sakes. The human side. The supply ship glided through the black void of space, its engines humming faintly as it streaked toward the Ilion Nebula. Inside, Aerith sat in the co-pilot's seat, her sharp eyes fixed on the swirling clouds of gas and stars in the distance. The cockpit was dimly lit, the silence between her and Kane heavy, but not entirely hostile. For the first time since their uneasy alliance had begun, they were alone. No soldiers, no distractions, just 2 warriors carrying their pain like armor. Kane's fingers danced over the controls as he navigated their course. Aerith watched him from the corner of her eye, studying his movements. He was efficient, disciplined, his every action deliberate. Yet there was a weariness in his posture, a weight that seemed to press down on him even when he was still. You're quiet, Kane said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't look at her, his eyes focused on the redouts in front of him. I thought you'd have more to say. Aerith's gaze sharpened. Do you want me to thank you, human, for dragging me into your war? Kane let out a dry chuckle. It's not my war. Not anymore. If anything, it's theirs. The mercenaries. The ones pulling the strings. I'm just trying to stop it from getting worse. Aerith leaned back in her seat, her arms crossed. And why should I believe you care? Your kind has done nothing but take and destroy. Why would you risk your life for mine? For a moment, Kane said nothing. Then he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Because I know what it's like to lose everything. Aerith stiffened, caught off guard by the sudden vulnerability in his voice. She narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Kane leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the controls. Years ago, before all this, I had a family, a wife, a daughter. They were everything to me. His voice softened, and for the first time, Aerith saw the man behind the soldier. When the war started, I was called to the front lines. I thought I was protecting them by fighting. But I was wrong. Aerith frowned. Her curiosity piqued despite herself. What happened? They were killed, Kane said simply, his voice heavy with sorrow. Not by your people, by mine. A rogue faction decided to bomb a city they thought was harboring alien sympathizers. My family was there. They didn't stand a chance. The revelation hit Aerith like a physical blow. She had expected him to deflect, to justify the actions of his kind. Instead, he had laid bare his own pain, his own loss. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, she said finally, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. Kane shook his head. Don't be. It's not your fault. But it's why I'm here, doing this. I couldn't save them. But maybe I can stop others from going through what I did. What you did. Aerith looked away, her emotions swirling. She had spent so long hating humans, blaming them for her suffering. But now, faced with Kane's story, she couldn't ignore the parallels between them. They were both survivors, both haunted by ghosts of the past. You think stopping these mercenaries will fix anything? She asked, her tone sharper than she intended. You think it will bring your family back? No, Kane admitted. But it's not about fixing the past. It's about protecting the future. Your people, my people, they're not so different. We both have innocence worth fighting for. Aerith considered his words, her fingers unconsciously brushing the hilt of her blade. She thought of her child, her bright eyes and infectious laughter. She had fought for revenge, but was that truly what her child would have wanted? Was vengeance enough to honor her memory? Before she could respond, an alert blared across the cockpit. Kane turned back to the controls, his expression hardening. We're approaching the nebula. Prepare yourself. Aerith straightened, her focus returning to the mission. The Ilian Nebula loomed ahead, its swirling clouds of gas and dust casting eerie shadows over the ship. It was a place of chaos and danger, a perfect hiding spot for those who thrived on deception. Kane activated the ship's scanners, his hands moving with practiced precision. The mercenaries' signal is faint, but it's there. They're using the nebula to mask their location. Aerith leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the redouts. How many ships? Too many for a direct assault, Kane admitted. But if we can get close enough, we can plant a tracking beacon on their flagship. It'll give us the intel we need to take them down. Aerith nodded, her mind already working through the logistics. And if we're caught? Kane glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Then we improvise. The tension in the cockpit shifted, their shared determination creating an unspoken bond. For the first time, Aerith felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Trust. It was fragile, like a single spark in the darkness, but it was there. As the ship plunged into the nebula, Aerith tightened her grip on her blade. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. A race against time. The swirling clouds of the Ilian Nebula surrounded their ship like a restless sea, casting shifting hues of red, gold, and deep purple across the cockpit. Visibility was near zero, with the dense gases interfering with sensors and making navigation perilous. Aerith gripped the edge of her seat, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement in the darkness beyond the viewport. Are you sure we're not flying straight into their fleet? She asked, her voice tense. Kane, his hand steady on the controls, gave her a sidelong glance. Not unless their fleet is invisible. The scanners are barely picking up anything through this nebula. If they're out there, they're just as blind as we are. That's comforting, she said dryly, her tone laced with sarcasm. Her nerves were raw, and the oppressive atmosphere of the nebula didn't help. The faint blip of a signal suddenly flashed on the console, and Kane leaned forward, his jaw tightening. There, he said, pointing to the display. It's faint, but it's definitely them. That's the mercenary flagship. Aerith studied the holographic representation of the signal. It's moving toward the outer rim of the nebula. Are they preparing for another attack? Kane nodded grimly. That's my guess. We don't have much time. If they leave the nebula, they'll vanish into hyperspace, and we'll lose them. Aerith's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of her plasma blade. Then we stop them here. Kane smirked faintly. That's the plan. But first, we need to plant the beacon. Without it, we'll never track them. Their ship veered closer to the signal, weaving through the dense, glowing clouds. The mercenary flagship came into view, a massive vessel bristling with weapons and surrounded by smaller escort ships. It was a fortress in space, its sleek, angular design radiating menace. Aerith's breath caught as she took in the sight. The scale of the fleet was overwhelming, far greater than she had anticipated. You didn't say they'd have an entire armada. I didn't know, Kane admitted, his expression grim. But we're already here. We stick to the plan. And if the plan fails? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Kane's smirk returned, a hint of recklessness in his eyes. Then we make a new one. Aerith rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. Despite herself, she was beginning to understand why humans were so unpredictable. Their ability to adapt, to face impossible odds with unwavering determination, was both infuriating and impressive. Kane brought the ship into a slow, deliberate approach, staying just outside the mercenary's sensor range. I'll pilot us close enough for you to deploy the beacon, he said. You're faster and quieter than I am. You'll have to do it. Aerith nodded, her heart pounding. I'll need cover if I'm spotted. I'll handle that, Kane said. Just get the beacon in place and get back here alive. The docking bay of the mercenary flagship loomed ahead, its open maw revealing a bustling interior. Using their stolen supply ship as cover, Kane maneuvered close enough for Aerith to make her move. With a final nod, she activated her stealth cloak and slipped out of the ship, her movements silent and precise. The interior of the docking bay was a chaotic hive of activity. Mercenaries moved in every direction, unloading cargo and maintaining their fleet. Aerith stayed in the shadows, her heart pounding as she crept toward the ship's hull. Every step brought her closer to the target, and to discovery. Reaching the underside of the flagship, she carefully affixed the tracking beacon to a concealed panel. The device activated with a faint hum, its signal linking back to Kane's ship. Aerith allowed herself a moment of relief. The first part of the mission was complete. But her reprieve was short-lived. A loud shout echoed across the bay, and she turned to see a group of mercenaries pointing in her direction. Her cloak had flickered, the dense energy fields of the nebula interfering with its effectiveness. Great, she muttered under her breath, drawing her plasma blade. The mercenaries rushed toward her, their weapons raised. Aerith moved like a shadow, her blade a blur of light as she deflected their attacks. Her agility and precision were unmatched, but the sheer number of enemies threatened to overwhelm her. Back on the ship, Kane watched the chaos unfold on his monitor. Damn it, he muttered, activating the ship's weapons. The supply ship's turrets roared to life, targeting the mercenaries and creating a diversion. Aerith seized the opportunity, using the confusion to make her escape. She sprinted back toward the ship, her breath ragged and her blade humming with energy. Kane brought the ship closer, the ramp lowering just as she reached it. Get in, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Aerith leaped onto the ramp, her blade still ignited as she turned to fend off the pursuing mercenaries. Kane hit the controls, the ship's engines flaring to life as they rocketed out of the docking bay. The mercenaries' weapons fired after them, but the ship's shields held firm. As they sped away from the flagship, Kane turned to Aerith, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "You always cut it that close." Aerith smirked, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. "I got the job done, didn't I?" Kane shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're something else, Aerith." She didn't respond, her thoughts already racing ahead. The beacon was in place, and they had the information they needed. But the battle was far from over. The mercenaries would retaliate, and the odds were still stacked against them. For now, though, they had won a small victory, and for the first time, Aerith felt a glimmer of hope that justice might be within reach. Forged by fire, the stars stretched endlessly as the tracking beacon transmitted its location, casting a blinking red dot on the holographic map in the cockpit. The mercenaries' flagship, now marked and exposed, was making its way toward a densely populated alien colony, an easy target for their next devastating assault. Aerith stood beside Kane, her expression sharp and determined as they prepared for the final confrontation. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her, but it was matched by a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, she wasn't driven by blind revenge. She was fighting for something bigger, for the lives of those who couldn't defend themselves, for the memory of her child, and for a chance to stop the cycle of destruction. Kane's fingers moved quickly over the ship's controls, his focus unshakable. "We'll intercept them here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map, a narrow asteroid field on the edge of the colony system. "It's the only choke point before they reach the colony. If we can disable their flagship, the rest of their fleet will scatter." "Disable?" Aerith's voice carried a sharp edge. "They deserve more than that. They need to be destroyed." Kane glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "If we can take down their command ship, we'll cripple their operations across multiple sectors. But going in guns blazing won't work. We're outnumbered, and they're better armed. We need precision, not brute force." Aerith wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. As much as she wanted to annihilate the mercenaries for what they'd done, recklessness would only lead to their failure. She nodded reluctantly. "What's the plan?" Kane tapped a few keys, bringing up a schematic of the flagship. "The beacon gave us their exact specs. Their shields are strongest on the forward hull, but they have a blind spot near the engine core. If we can disable it, the entire ship will be dead in the water." "And how do we get close enough to do that?" Aerith asked, crossing her arms. Kane smirked, his eyes gleaming with a mix of confidence and defiance. "I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, but you'll have to trust me." Aerith's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm starting to think that might be the most dangerous part of this mission." The plan was set, and the countdown began. As the ship hurtled toward the asteroid field, Kane activated the stealth systems, masking their approach. The nebula's interference worked to their advantage, making it nearly impossible for the mercenaries to detect them until it was too late. Inside the cockpit, the tension was palpable. Kane's hands moved deftly over the controls, guiding the ship through the dense field of rocks and debris. Aerith sat beside him, her plasma blade resting across her lap, its faint hum a steady reminder of the battle ahead. "Almost there," Kane muttered, his eyes fixed on the approaching flagship. "Once we're in range, I'll need you to." The ship lurched violently as an asteroid grazed their shields, the impact sending sparks flying across the console. Alarms blared, and Aerith gripped the edge of her seat to steady herself. "Could you avoid the rocks?" she snapped, her voice laced with irritation. Kane grinned despite the situation. "Where's the fun in that?" Before she could respond, the flagship came into view, its massive silhouette dominating the horizon. Smaller escort ships flanked it, their weapons scanning the area for any sign of threat. Kane slowed their approach, keeping them hidden in the shadows of the asteroids. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "You ready?" Aerith nodded, her grip tightening on her blade. Let's end this. The next few moments were a blur of movement and chaos. Aerith slipped out of the ship once more, her stealth cloak shimmering as she moved toward the flagship's engine core. The mercenaries' patrols were heavier this time, but her agility and training allowed her to slip past them undetected. Reaching the engine core, she planted a series of charges along the ship's primary power conduits. The explosives were small but devastating, designed to disable the flagship's systems without completely destroying the ship. As she worked, her thoughts raced. Of her child, of her people, of the countless lives depending on her success. Back on the ship, Kane monitored her progress, his fingers poised over the controls. When Aerith's voice came through the comms, his heart leaped. Charges are set. Get me out of here. Kane activated the extraction sequence, maneuvering the ship into position. Aerith sprinted toward the docking ramp, her cloak flickering as she dodged enemy fire. The moment she was aboard, Kane hit the thrusters, their ship rocketing away from the flagship. Detonating in 3, 2, 1. Aerith pressed the trigger. The charges exploded with a brilliant flash, sending shockwaves rippling through the flagship. Its lights flickered and died, its engine sputtering as the ship drifted helplessly in space. The escort ships, disoriented and leaderless, scattered into the void. Aerith leaned back against the wall, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "We did it," she said, her voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. Kane turned to her, a small smile on his face. "You did it. I was just along for the ride." The aftermath was quiet, almost eerily so. As the colony came into view, its people unaware of how close they had come to annihilation, Aerith felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, her fight wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Kane glanced at her, his expression softening. "So what now?" Aerith didn't answer immediately. She stared out at the stars, her thoughts a mix of grief and hope. Finally, she spoke. "Now, we rebuild." Kane nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. Together, they had faced the darkness and come out stronger, and though their paths might diverge, they knew they had forged something unbreakable, a bond forged by fire.